On October 14th, 1888, when dawn stood at 28 degrees and the first hard frost turned the river grass to silver wire, Brett Harmon rode into Cedar Bluff in the Wyoming Territory with 2 children, 1 canvas-topped wagon, and $32 in coin wrapped in oilcloth inside his coat. The town's census board, nailed crooked beside the post office door, listed 347 souls in chalk. Cedar Bluff sat low along a bend that looked gentle in autumn and treacherous in thaw, with 1 church, 1 schoolhouse, 1 grain elevator, and a main street of timber fronts that boasted more confidence than age. Freight teams came twice each month, if weather held. If weather did not hold, the settlement became an island of its own making. Brett studied the river before he studied the town, because he had buried a wife that spring and had no remaining patience for pretty assumptions. Her name had been Eliza Harmon, and she had died of fever on March 9th, 1888, 3 days after they crossed into Nebraska on a contracted freight run. The burial took place in wind that never settled, at a small rise where wagon ruts crossed like unstitched seams. Brett did not speak of that grave in public. He did not speak much at all after it. Yet his silence did not resemble surrender. It resembled measurement. He set his family in a sod house on the town's north edge, where the lot was cheap because spring runoff pooled there, and he paid $6 down for title with terms due after harvest. The source of his discipline lay further south and earlier in hardship. His father, Josiah Harmon of Tennessee Hill Country, had taught rope work as first knowledge, not trade knowledge, in a valley where rain could turn a pass into a trap by nightfall. Josiah learned from his own mother, who had crossed floodplain farms as a girl with lines tied from porch post to cottonwood trunk. Brett carried that chain forward without ceremony, hand before boast, not before argument, preparation before pride. He had refined the method while working freight routes between Fort Laramie and the railheads, where a snapped line could cost cargo, team, and life in one instant. He imposed one order in his new household that drew stares from the first week. Nathaniel, 12, and Rose, 8, would learn to harvest, comb, twist, and braid prairie fiber into usable rope before they learned letters beyond their names. Slate tablets and primers could wait. Stormwater would not wait. In the morning they fetched bluestem and switchgrass from higher ground, cutting above the root with short knives to preserve next season's stand. At noon they soaked sorted bundles in a cedar trough behind the sod wall. At dusk they hung fibers to temper under the eaves, then sat by lantern while Brett taught tension, splice, and lay direction with the steadiness of church instruction. Their hands toughened. Their fingertips split and healed. The coils grew. When chores ended, Nathaniel sometimes traced his name in frost on the trough lid, and Rose copied the letters beside his. Brett saw it, said nothing, and tipped his chin toward the rope-walk posts. They returned to twisting fiber until lantern oil ran low. Silas Pemberton noticed quickly, because Silas noticed any habit that did not pass through his store first. He owned the general store, held a standing seat on the town council, and carried prosperity like a uniform. Broadcloth coat that fit too well for frontier labor. Polished boots with imported nails. Beard trimmed square each Saturday. Gold watch chain bright against a vest that no dust seemed able to dull. From his porch, he watched the Harmon yard and laughed loud enough for mule skinners and clerks alike. There sits Harmon's grass Bible. He told a knot of ranch hands one cold afternoon, pointing with his pipe stem toward the rope-walk posts Brett had set. He preaches weeds while sensible families buy hemp. The phrase traveled with the easy speed of borrowed cruelty. By month's end, boys repeated it in alleys and grown men repeated it near the loading dock, each one pretending the words had begun in his own clever mouth. Brett answered once, and only to his children. while they reset a twisted lay that had gone soft in the middle. "Let them talk," he said. "Words do not keep out the wind." Then he returned to work. By the second week of November, his yard had become a disciplined operation, measured down to inches and ounces. He set 2 cottonwood posts 84 feet apart to make a rope walk aligned east to west, using morning sun to reveal uneven twist and weak fiber sheen. He drove each post 4 feet into tamped earth and braced them with diagonal members cut from scavenged wagon tongues. A hand-crank spinner, built from an iron hook assembly and a maple wheel taken off a broken churn, let Nathaniel maintain even rotation while Rose fed damp fibers through a smooth ash guide. Brett kept 3 product classes and no guesswork. Light grass cord at 1/4 inch for lashing and tool ties. Midweight rope at 1/2 inch with a rawhide core for hauling and drag work. Heavy braid at 3/4 inch, finished with tarred wraps at stress points for rescue loads. Every finish coil received a leather tag cut from scrap harness and marked in charcoal: length, diameter, test date, and load result. Testing was done against stone and slope, never against hope. Brett loaded a sandstone sled to measured weights, beginning at 200 pounds and increasing in 100-pound increments to 600. He recorded slippage, fiber bloom, and splice creep on a pine board hung inside the shed. Any line that failed was cut and reworked into shorter utility lengths. No flawed strand was stored as if confidence could mend it. He built loft racks 4 feet above floor level to keep rope dry through snowmelt, spaced slats 1 hand wide for air circulation, and laid cedar chips beneath to discourage rot. Costs were tracked with equal rigor. 2 new augers, $1.20. Iron rings from a blacksmith in Elkhorn, $2 for a lot of 12. Pine tar in sealed tins, 80 cents each. He bought in coin and wrote each expense in a ledger beside expected service life. Cedar Bluff saw only bundles of grass. Brett saw load paths, failure points, and survival hours. Winter set hard by December, then held. The river froze in shelves along the north bank. Men on Main Street slapped frost from their sleeves and called it another season endured. Pemberton's store sold out of wool blankets before Christmas and brought in fresh stock at a markup. Brett heard the prices while buying nails and watched men sign Pemberton's credit book without argument. Each morning he saw children pass with readers and sums tucked under their arms, and more than one parent let a glance slide past the Harmon yard, as if not seeing it at all. Yet rope coils continued to rise in their racks, row after row, pale gold darkening to amber where tar wraps cured. Nathaniel could finish a 50-foot 1/2 inch line in under an hour by February. Rose could tie a bowline in darkness by touch alone, and could identify weak braid by sound when a strand was snapped near her ear. By late March 1889, thaw began in uneven pulses, warm days followed by night freeze, and the ground above town sweated water into every low track. Brett walked bank lines at dusk and before dawn, measuring not only level, but speed, color, and debris. He marked cottonwood trunks with knife cuts to track rise over time. He noted where drift gathered against old pilings, where ferry chains hummed under strain, and where the mud along the inside bend lost its hold. He said little in public and nothing grand. Work remained his language. In the Harmon yard, new posts appeared beside older ones, and extra coils were moved from loft to wagon bed for rapid loading if called. From Main Street porches, Brett caught fewer jokes when he hauled coils past, but the same men still leaned on railings and spoke of spring trade as if weather owed them terms. On March 30th, 1889, Brett stood at the north bank before sunrise while Nathaniel held the pole and Rose counted notches aloud. New water lipped the lowest cut mark, then climbed it by noon, carrying reed clumps and fence splinters from upstream. On April 27th, rain drummed the sod roof through supper as they shifted pre-measured coils from loft to door racks, and Brett reassigned anchor kits by street grade, then sent both children to bed in work clothes. On May 3rd, 1889, the noon thermometer outside the post office read 74 degrees in full shade, and men stood in shirt sleeves along Main Street, speaking of early planting, while meltwater whispered under the bridge in a tone too fast for that warmth. The sky above Cedar Bluff looked clean and high, yet to the west a dark shelf of mountain cloud kept reforming by evening, never breaking over town, as if weather were gathering weight out of sight. Brett Harmon saddled before first light and rode the north and east bends with a measuring pole tied to his stirrup. He found the beaver works stacked a full hand, higher than in any week of April. Cottonwood roots lay freshly exposed along sections that usually held until midsummer. Before dawn, the current ran brown, with silt heavy enough to drag reeds flat at the inside bend. By the time church bell rang 9, he had cut 3 new marks in a riverbank stake and could place 2 fingers between each mark. The river had risen that much in 6 hours. He crossed to the ferry landing and stepped off distance with his boots, heel to toe, from chain post to dry ground, then back again. 12 paces remained where 20 had stood the prior morning. The ferry operator, Abram Pike, watched in silence with his cap in both hands, then said that upstream ranchers had sent word of hard rain in the foothills through most of the night. Brett asked how many inches. Abram said no gauge was kept, only memory, and memory said too much for spring. When Brett rode back through town, he did not stop for coffee or talk at the hitch rail. He changed horses, took his ledger board from the shed, and walked to the council room behind Silas Pemberton's store with mud still drying on his boots. The council sat with 7 members present, including Pemberton at the head, Mayor Elias Crowell beside him, and 2 ranch holders whose herds grazed higher country. Brett laid his board on the table and pointed to cut marks, times, and observed debris load, then to a charcoal map showing low streets, alley grades, and structures likely to take first impact if a debris surge struck the north bend. He spoke in the same level tone he used while teaching knots. He asked permission to set anchor posts along Main Street, 1 at each intersection with iron rings at shoulder height and cross braces buried 5 feet. He asked that church bell be used for flood signal if water reached his second bank mark. He offered to train each household in 2 evenings, basic loop, chest hitch, and line travel in current, adults first shift, children second. He requested no payment, only labor and access. Pemberton waited until Brett finished, then folded his hands over his watch chain. "Flood rumor in planting month destroys trade before water touches a porch," he said. "You asked this council to post fear in the middle of commerce, to drive families from stores into ditches because beavers built high." He turned the ledger board and tapped the charcoal map with 1 finger. "Cedar Bluff does not govern by yard conjecture. We govern by calm." 1 ranch holder nodded. The other asked whether the railroad agent in Elkhorn had sent warning. No warning had come. Mayor Crowell said the council would review conditions after Sunday service. Brett answered that Sunday would likely be late if mountain rain continued. Pemberton replied that panic would be earlier still. The request was denied by voice vote, 5-2. By the first week of May, Brett had spent the last of his $32 and borrowed no credit from any book in town. Iron rings from the smith in Elkhorn cost $2 for 12 in March. He now paid $3.10 for another 12 because road mud slowed delivery. Oak pegs 1 inch thick and 20 inches long cost 90 cents per dozen. 2 mule traces for reinforcing pull lines cost $1.40 each, worn but sound. A keg of pine tar ran to $1 even. He sold the spare wagon lantern and one beaver pelt from winter trade to cover shortfall. When Nathaniel asked whether they should hold coin for flour, Brett set 3 sacks aside from existing stock, measured at 90 pounds total, and said flour without a dry roof was a short argument. Work by lantern began that same night and continued until moonset. Rose sorted grasses by fiber length on a canvas spread marked in chalk lines, under 20 inches for packing and light lash, 20 to 32 for cordage, above 32 for braid sections. Nathaniel cranked the spinner until his shoulders shook, then shifted to hand lay when wheel teeth warmed and slipped. Brett handled splices, cores, and stress wraps, then moved finished lengths to loft racks. 2 widowed neighbors joined after dusk, Miriam Hale from the Blacksmith Lane and Clara Ortega from Telegraph Hill, each bringing her own knife and gloves. Miriam's husband, Gideon Hale, mocked no work done in earnest and sent scrap leather for tags. Clara brought old telegraph wire sleeves that Brett flattened and used as chafe guards around ring points. The yard no longer looked like a family task. It looked like a small manufactory run against a clock no one else admitted was running. Silas Pemberton answered this with market force and ridicule in equal measure. He marked factory hemp rope at triple spring price, from 11 cents per foot to 33, and told teamsters that scarcity required discipline from buyers. He also told them, loudly and in daylight, that only a fool trusted weeds over hemp when water rose, and that any soul tying family to field grass might as well tie them to prayer alone. The line reached ranch bunkhouses by supper. By Saturday, it returned to town as common speech. 3 laborers who had agreed to help Brett after chores withdrew by noon, each one reporting that store credit would be reviewed if they were seen encouraging hazard. No law was cited. None was needed. Pemberton's ledger carried half the town through winter, and debt is a quiet sheriff. Brett made no speech against him. He changed method. Instead of seeking public crews, he divided the work into loads small enough for children and widows to move quickly. Coils were pre-measured in standard bundles of 30 feet and 60 feet, each tied with color thread at both ends, blue for light line, red for haul line, black for rescue braid. Anchor kits were packed in feed sacks, each kit containing 2 rings, 4 pegs, and 1 mallet wrapped in burlap to muffle sound. Route boards were cut from scrap crate wood and marked with charcoal arrows, showing intended line paths from higher porches to second stories, and from second stories to roof edges. He drilled Nathaniel and Rose on carrying coils across uneven ground without tangling lay direction. They practiced in wind and then in darkness, counting steps from shed to gate, gate to alley, alley to church fence, until they could run it blind and arrive with line untwisted. 3 days passed before the first surge struck. It came near dawn after steady night rain, not as a wall but as a hard, fast rise that undercut the low ferry landing and snapped 1 mooring chain before sunrise. By breakfast, both supply wagons expected from the east had halted at the wash beyond Cotton Draw, unwilling to risk axle-deep crossings with current still climbing. Cedar Bluff was not yet flooded, but by noon it had become provisionally isolated. The effect on town temperament was immediate and brittle. Men who had mocked the rope walk now stood in knots beside the bridge, staring downstream at logs and brush moving faster than a horse could trot. Women filled extra buckets and asked whether school would dismiss early. Pemberton posted a notice that freight delay was temporary and stock remained sufficient for normal purchase limits. He did not post prices. He did not reduce them either. That evening, Brett rode to the church, the schoolhouse, and the grain elevator with 2 sacks and a shovel, taking alleys where possible and keeping to shadow when the moon cleared cloud. At each site he set what freight men called a dead man anchor, though he had learned the method from his father long before he learned its name. He dug trenches 5 feet deep and 6 feet long, laid cottonwood beams wrapped in tarred canvas, passed braided line around beam center through iron ring, then backfilled with compacted earth and stone tamped in lifts. Each completed anchor left only a ring visible at grade, black with tar and easy to miss unless one knew where to look. At the church, he aligned the ring with the bell tower stair so lines could be raised above window level. At the schoolhouse, he placed 2 rings, one for entry line and one for return line, 8 feet apart to prevent crossing under strain. At the elevator, he set the heaviest beam near the north wall where flood force would first strike. Nathaniel held lantern low and shielded. Rose packed earth with a short tamper cut to her height. Near midnight, while they worked behind the school fence, Reverend Amos Bell came out carrying his coat over one arm and asked what they were burying on church property and public ground. Brett answered with plain inventory, showed ring and splice, and said the line would either sit unused or carry children, and either outcome justified the labor. The Reverend stood a long moment with rain gathering on his hat brim, then removed one cufflink and used it to scrape mud from a ring groove where tar had pooled. He said nothing further, only took the tamper from Rose for 10 strokes and handed it back. By dawn, the final trench was closed. The yard racks were half empty, and a full route map in charcoal hung inside the Harmon shed wall, weighted at corners by nails driven into sod. On June 10th, with river level holding high and western thunder sounding each afternoon, Cedar Bluff moved through a deceptive quiet that resembled safety, only from a distance. Children still recited lessons in the schoolhouse, though benches nearest the door were now stacked with rolled blankets and dry socks. Teamsters still argued freight rates beside Pemberton's porch, though their wagons stood unloaded and their eyes kept returning to the bridge. Pemberton himself purchased 2 60-foot black thread rescue braids from Nathaniel at dusk, paid cash, and ordered the coils sent to his warehouse roof through the rear alley so that no one need discuss it. Nathaniel delivered them without comment and returned before dark. In the Harmon yard, Brett checked every knot once more, reset one chafe guard at the church ring, and told his children to sleep in work clothes with boots by the door. The rain began again just after midnight, and Brett rose before the second burst struck, lit the shed lantern, and set the kettle over a low fire so tar would warm without scorching, while Nathaniel and Rose carried black thread coils from the loft to the bench in the order marked on the ledger board. Wet weather changed the whole method of rope work because fibers swelled, tension shifted, and a line that tested true in dry air could open half a turn under sustained soak. Brett therefore ran every rescue braid through a second inspection cycle before dawn, stripping old wraps where needed, brushing grit from the lay with a stiff horsehair brush, and adding chafe sleeves cut from flattened telegraph sheathing at exactly the points where iron rings would bear weight. He measured each sleeve to 6 inches and fixed it with pitch and whipcord. Nothing was guessed. Nothing was rushed. By sunrise on June 11th, the yard looked less like a homestead than a small works yard built for municipal labor, with root bundles stacked by destination rather than diameter. Church line crate, school line crate, elevator line crate, and 3 reserve crates for street crossings if the current entered Maine. Miriam Hale kept the record chalk dry beneath an inverted pan and copied each test result onto pine slats hung under the shed eave, where rain could not blur the figures. Clara Ortega stitched canvas carry straps onto the heavier bundles so a single adult could shoulder 60 feet and still keep one hand free for railings. Nathaniel recut pegs blunted by hard ground and drove sample rings into a timber stump to rehearse fast attachment in poor light. Rose sorted spare lengths into emergency kits packed with wool blankets, tallow candles, and 2 biscuits wrapped in waxed paper. She tied each packet with a small loop that could be opened with numb fingers The work continued through the morning in deliberate rotation. While one line cured under eave shade, another line went to wet load testing at the sandstone sled trench behind the house. Brett increased the test weight by measured increments to account for soaked fiber gain, from 600 pounds dry standard to 680 pounds wet standard, and he recorded elongation in fractions of an inch using a marked plank fixed between posts. If stretch exceeded 1 inch over 30 feet under static hold, the line was reclassified from rescue to haul. By noon, they had downgraded 4 lines and rebuilt 2 with new core wrap. By evening, they had produced 3 additional rescue lengths, each 60 feet, each tagged with date, maker, and ring assignment. The rain did not break. The walls held. On June 12th, one day after the midnight shift, Brett added a second rope walk lane parallel to the first, using salvaged axle iron as spindle supports and a borrowed grindstone stand as a tensioning frame. The added lane allowed paired braiding, one crew laying fresh fiber while a second crew repaired weathered lines, and production nearly doubled despite the moisture in the air. He paid 2 boys from the rail camp 10 cents each to carry water and keep the trough levels even. Cash at sunset. No credit, no promises. He paid Reverend Bell in labor exchange, replacing the church well crank in return for use of the rear yard as temporary drying ground under the porch overhang. The Reverend accepted with a nod, and no sermon. By dusk, 42 finished coils sat in ordered rows on the rack, leather tags turned outward like book spines in a careful library. On June 13th, with cloud ceiling low and river noise present even from Main Street, Silas Pemberton changed from ridicule to policy. A printed notice appeared on his porch, copied by hand and pinned again at the post office and school gate. Unauthorized fixtures on commercial facades would be removed to preserve public order and prevent liability for accidental injury. No law book citation followed the warning, but the signature line carried both Pemberton's name and Mayor Crowell's. Teamsters read it aloud beside the hitch rail. 2 clerks from the store walked the block with pry bars and pulled 3 practice rings that Brett had set at shoulder height on abandoned fence posts near the livery lane. They left the dead man anchors untouched because those lay below grade and were not easily found, yet the message was clear. Preparation would be tolerated in private so long as it remained invisible. Public readiness offended commerce. Mockery took on sharper edges once it wore official paper. Men who had once laughed from porches now refused day labor if it touched Harmon lines. One ranch foreman said in hearing of half the street that a town could not be tied together like loose cargo and still call itself civilized. A school trustee told another parent that knot drills in a child's hands were an admission of institutional failure. Pemberton, standing beneath his awning while rain blew in slant sheets across the boardwalk, called out to a circle of buyers that Cedar Bluff needed arithmetic and discipline, not rope games and ditch engineering from a freight widower. His words were repeated at supper tables and in church vestibules with minor variations, then returned to Brett stripped of pretense as plain instruction. Keep your lines in your yard. The exclusion reached the children by the next morning. Nathaniel was told he could attend recitation if he left rope tags at home and sat rear bench without trade talk. Rose was asked by another girl why her hands smelled of tar and marsh, and whether her father planned to tie the schoolhouse to the moon. Neither child answered in kind. They finished lessons, walked home in rain, and set immediately to brushing silt from a drag test line without complaint. Brett saw the silence at their shoulders and gave no speech to soften it. He assigned tasks and worked beside them until lamplight blurred the edges of the bench. Persistence became both answer and shield. By the second week of June, the social pressure turned institutional again, when council posted a temporary rule that no bell would be rung for hazard warning without majority vote from 2 council members present in town. The stated reason was to prevent false alarm. The practical effect was delay. Brett read the notice once, folded it, and placed it beneath the ledger board in the shed. That same afternoon, he visited Mayor Crowell with a written request for a standing exception if river markers reached specified cuts. Crowell received him on the porch, accepted the paper, and said the town must avoid panic in a season already strained by freight interruption. No exception was granted. The request was not returned. It simply vanished into municipal quiet. Yet, while mockery broadened, practical observation narrowed toward certainty. On June 14th, Brett rode with Abram Pike at first light and found the ferry chain vibrating in steady pulses even during brief lulls, a sign of heavy push upstream. Debris changed character from reeds and branch litter to work timber with cut ends, likely from structures broken above the bend. Silt color deepened from brown to near black in mooring troughs. Beavers abandoned 2 low runs and moved to higher bank lodges within 48 hours, a pattern Abram said he had not seen in 15 seasons on that crossing. Cottonwood leaves near the low cut shone with fine mud, speckling 2 feet above prior flood stain. None of these signs carried drama by itself. Taken together, they formed a single sentence written in water. Brett sought verification through the telegraph line before noon. He asked Thomas Ortega on Telegraph Hill to wire upstream stations at Granite Crossing and North Fork for rain totals, bridge status, and river stage changes over the past 3 days. Tomas sent the queries at 12 minutes past 1, then again at 26 minutes past 1, when static interrupted the first dispatch. Replies arrived in fragments before dusk. Mountain rain continuous. Culvert overtops reported. 1 trestle approach compromised. Line quality poor. Tomas copied each fragment onto message slips and handed them to Brett and then to the council clerk. The clerk read, frowned, and said partial reports could not form policy. The slips were filed. No public notice followed. On June 15th, Cedar Bluff received a brief interval of sun that many called proof the danger had passed, and Main Street filled with small acts of relief as laundry appeared on lines and storefront doors stood open to dry plank floors. Brett used the clear hours to move from private manufacture to route rehearsal. He marked line paths in discrete chalk behind buildings, then ran timed drills with Miriam and Clara from church ring to school return point, counting steps and knot sequence aloud. Anchor hitch, chest loop, belay check, transfer. Nathaniel carried spare coils. Rose carried mallet and pegs, and both children practiced passing knots through ring points without losing footing on wet boards. They repeated each route until completion times dropped below 4 minutes in ordinary conditions. When thunder returned at dusk, they had completed 6 full circuits and 2 night circuits by lantern. The same evening, Pemberton opened his rear warehouse to selected merchants and offered private storage on upper racks at elevated rates, payable in cash or promissory notes secured against autumn receipts. Word spread quickly that his roof access had been improved with 2 fresh black thread lines tied near the west hatch, lines bought from the Harmon Yard and now presented as prudent inventory management rather than admission. Several who had mocked the rope work paid for rack space before supper. Others watched and said nothing. The town had begun to split between spoken certainty and quiet preparation. No one named the split in public. On June 16th, rain resumed with a steadiness that erased road edges and filled every wheel rut to the lip, and the river's sound became audible inside shuttered rooms. Not loud, but continuous, like millstones turning out of sight. Brett moved all remaining dry fiber indoors, suspended finished coils from rafters to keep them clear of splash, and shifted food stores to the loft platform above shoulder height. 90 pounds flour, 20 pounds beans, smoked rabbit in waxed cloth, and 2 crocks of tallow sealed tight. He then took Nathaniel and Rose building to building along the North Rise and showed them fallback routes if primary lines failed, emphasizing hand placement, knot checks, and where to cut a snagged line without jeopardizing the load. He spoke in exact terms. They repeated them back exactly. By June 17th, warning signs multiplied faster than civic patience. 2 hog pens near the low lane broke overnight as animals pressed against slats toward higher ground. Barn swallows nested under the bridge moved to the church eaves in a single afternoon. The inside bend lost another full pace of bank by sunset, collapsing in slabs that spun away whole and vanished beneath surface chop. Abram Pike tied his ferry skiff above the usual moor and told 3 different listeners he would not run crossings after dark for any fare. 1 listener agreed. 2 laughed and said old rivermen feared every June. Brett heard each report, entered each one in chalk, and crossed out no line. On the morning of the 18th of June, he made one final attempt at collective warning. He stood outside the council room with wet hat in hand and asked for immediate public drill at the churchyard before evening meal. 1 hour only, no speeches, knot and line travel instruction for any household that wished to attend. Pemberton answered from the doorway that business could not be suspended by private alarm, and that public confidence was itself a civic asset in strained times. Mayor Crowell said the matter would be reviewed if conditions worsened. Brett nodded once, turned away, and walked directly to his shed where the root board hung. He assigned stations for every helper willing to stand in rain. No argument followed him. No apology did either. Toward dusk, the rain thickened again, and low cloud erased the ridge to the west so completely that town and sky seemed pressed into one gray plain. Brett checked each anchor ring by hand, tested every visible knot, and placed reserve coils beneath oilcloth at church, schoolhouse, and elevator points. Nathaniel carried the final black thread bundle to the church stair and returned with the empty sling. Rose counted candle stubs and wrapped them in a dry rag for quick lighting if night work began. Across Main Street, lamps glowed in Pemberton's upper windows while men moved ledgers and crates to higher shelves. Along the riverbank, the highest cut mark took fresh water before full dark and held there, trembling as if deciding whether to climb further before dawn. It chose before midnight. At 10:40, with the air at 43 degrees and rain driving nearly sideways from the northwest, water crossed the lower ferry road and began filling wagon ruts in a continuous sheet instead of scattered pools. At 11:25, Abram Pike rode through town, striking doorframes with a stick and calling that the ferry chain had begun to jump like live iron. At 12:10 on June 19th, 1889, the chain snapped. The report carried over Cedar Bluff like a rifle crack and then vanished into rain. Brett did not wait for council vote or bell permission. He sent Nathaniel to the church anchor station with 2 reserve coils, sent Rose to the schoolhouse return ring with candle tin and mallet, and tied his own chest hitch under the shed eave, where the light held steady enough to check knot lay twice. Miriam Hale took the church ledger slate and began marking names of souls moved from low ground. Clara Ortega ran between points with message slips wrapped in oilcloth. Reverend Bell, having watched the river swallow the lower grave path by lantern glow, climbed to the tower and rang the bell without sanction. 3 long strikes repeated at intervals until the rope burned his palm and his voice failed from shouting. For 1 hour the town remained in that strained interval when denial still looked possible from a second-story window. Lamps moved in houses. Men shouted instructions that sounded orderly. Pemberton's clerks carried crates from the general store to the warehouse loft and stacked ledgers on upper planks. tied with twine tags for account classes: feed, cloth, credit, interest. Two merchants who had rented his private rack space paid boys to move bolt goods higher still. On Main Street, where boardwalks sat almost 1 foot above spring grade, water first appeared as a thin black run around porch posts, and then rose by finger widths between one watch check and the next. By 1:35, it was at knee depth near the livery corner. By 1:50, loose barrels were drifting against the school fence. At 2:10 in the morning, after 9 straight hours of mountain rain had fed every channel above Cedar Bluff, a debris surge struck the North Bend with force no voice could overstate. It came not as a single crest, but as a packed, moving wall of timber, brush, fencing, and dark water that hit the outside bank, split, and drove through the low streets in 2 hard currents. One current took the Ferry Lane and Blacksmith Row. The other cut diagonally through Main Street toward the grain elevator. Porch fronts sheared, hitch rails uprooted and spun. A team wagon lifted, turned broadside, and broke against the church fence. The wind had not caused this ruin. Water had. The river was not river anymore. It was a weapon. Brett entered the first crossing tied to the primary black thread line from Church Ring to the second-story window of the Pike boarding house annex. The current struck his legs with enough force to turn him half sideways, and only the chest hitch held him to direction. Nathaniel fed line from the church stair and measured pulls, gloved hands locked around the running segment, while Rose kept return loops clear of snag with a boat hook cut down to her height. Brett reached the window, set a transfer hitch around a roof beam, and sent 2 boarders back one by one, each clipped at waist and chest, each hauled by church team and received by Miriam and Reverend Bell on dry planking above the nave door. He returned immediately, then again, then again. Count replaced fear because count was usable. 4 souls moved. 8. 11. By 3:00, the water in Lower Main had reached chest height on a grown man, and the current carried whole sections of fence with nails still set. Plans that had looked sufficient by lamplight failed in sequence and in public. Boats launched from the livery yard overturned against hidden debris before reaching 2 houses. A hemp line bought that week at triple price stretched wet, slipped a post knot, and let go with a sound like cloth tearing. The council notice about Bell Authority dissolved from the post office wall and wrapped itself around a porch column before disappearing downstream. Pemberton's warehouse, whose elevated racks had been sold as prudent salvation, took water through lower siding seams. Flour sacks on first tier darkened, split, and slumped into paste, while bolts of cloth floated from open cases and snagged in stair rails like flags of surrender. At Telegraph Hill, Thomas Ortega remained at key and battery table as long as floorboards stayed fixed. He sent one final warning downstream at 3:18, tapping through static that broke every third word. Surge at Cedar Bluff. North Bend failure. Seek high structures. Lines unstable. Clara had carried him dry candles at midnight and had begged him to leave when water reached the office threshold. Thomas answered by handing her his mother's copper saint medallion and telling her to run the church route before the alley cut off. She obeyed and survived. Thomas did not. The office roof collapsed from a log strike at the rear corner shortly after transmission ended. His key was found 2 days later tangled in willow roots half a mile south. The Blacksmith Lane failed next. Gideon Hale had spent the first hours hauling strangers onto his forge roof with a chain sling and a ladder tied flat as a dragboard. When a wagon team from Cotton Draw broke loose and began to spin toward 3 trapped souls near the Cooper shed, he went back into current with an axe to cut harness traces before hooves and wheel could crush the doorway. He severed one strap, then the second, and shouted for the trapped men to go. They went. A timber beam struck the wagon tongue and threw the entire rig broadside. Gideon disappeared in the churn beside his own anvil post. At dawn, Miriam identified him by the brass rivet pattern on his work belt where it had snagged a cedar stump above town. She stood without speaking while Reverend Bell removed his hat. Then she returned to the church line and resumed receiving rescues. Abram Pike, who had warned first and loudest, held the ferry road he had worked for 15 seasons and refused a full night crossing once the current went feral. He tied his skiff above the usual moor, as promised, and used a banked tether to move 2 elderly sisters from a low porch to the grain stair without taking the boat into open channel. On the next run, a floating gate panel punched the bow offline and pinned the skiff against a cottonwood trunk. Abram cut one rope, then another, and held the sisters clear until church line reached them. They were pulled to safety, and Abram was hauled in after them with a torn shoulder and hands split to the palm, alive. Before dawn, he gave Reverend Bell the name no one wanted entered. Ruth Ann Pike, age 9, found beneath the collapsed boarding house stair with her school reader held tight against her chest. The suffering widened beyond named loss into a town-scale breaking of certainty. Families who had trusted cellar storage watched preserves burst loose and vanish. Men who had refused knot drills clung to porch eaves with numb hands until line crews reached them. Livestock bellowed from trapped corrals and then went quiet, one pen at a time. Children were passed in blankets above shoulder level through second-story windows into receiving arms at church and elevator loft, while adults waited for return lines because load order had to favor the small and weak first. The count on Miriam's slate climbed through the dark toward half the town, moved, treated, fed, reassigned. Cedar Bluff had listed 347 souls in October. By sunrise, nearly every one of those souls had depended on rope, knots, and anchored paths for one decision, one crossing, one breath. The help was finally sought in words no one could mistake. Near 4:05, Mayor Crowell reached the church stair soaked to the waist, hat gone, coat torn at sleeve, and asked Brett for direct command of rescue routes because council runners were scattered and no other system was holding. He did not ask as a formality. He asked because 3 attempts had failed within 20 minutes, and because Brett's map board, now nailed to the church door, was the only plan still producing survivors. Brett answered by assigning Crowell to head count relay and doorway clearance, then sent him back out with 2 men and 1 blue thread line for short-haul transfers, where current broke around the school corner. Rank did not matter. Task did. 10 minutes later, a clerk from Pemberton's store, Eli Tanner, age 19 and shaking so hard he could not keep his lantern steady, stumbled to the church ring and shouted that Pemberton was trapped on his warehouse roof with 2 renters and no secure descent. The rear ladder had torn away, and the lines on that roof were tied for cargo, not bodies. Brett did not pause to weigh the request against prior insult. He took 1 60-foot black thread braid, 1 reserve chafe sleeve, and 2 iron rings, clipped in, and ran the alley route with Nathaniel feeding and Rose managing return slack from the church station. Water there moved like a mill race between walls. Twice Brett had to duck floating beams. Once he went under to the shoulders and came up against siding with breath driven out of him. The line held. On the warehouse roof, Pemberton stood with ledgers tied to his waist by a belt strap, as if accounts could be carried through flood like coin through market. His beard was plastered flat by rain, his broadcloth coat dark with river water, his polished boots gone. Brett shouted over the current for him to cut the books free, take the chest loop and clip both hands over line above knot. Pemberton hesitated once, then took out a knife and severed the strap. The ledgers dropped into black water and vanished between crates. 1 renter crossed first and reached church receiving hands. The second crossed next. Pemberton crossed last, suspended above the alley current by the same grass and rawhide braid he had called weeds in daylight. When he reached the church stair, he collapsed to his knees, coughed water, and made room for the next rescue without speaking. By first light, rain had eased to a hard drizzle, and the temperature had dropped to 38 degrees. The surge still ran fast through lower streets, but the peak had passed. Bells no longer rang. Orders were given by voice along fixed lines. Pull, hold, send, clear. Send. Brett moved from station to station, checking anchors, replacing one worn sleeve at the school ring, and reassigning crews where hands had gone numb. No soul was turned away for debt, for mockery, or for delay. Cedar Bluff stood broken, soaked, and grieving, but it stood with a network now visible across its ruined streets. Black lines from ring to beam to stair, drawn by labor that had been scorned until the hour it became the only road left. By 6 in the morning, Brett had moved the rescue map from the church door to the nave table and turned survival into a schedule. Warming fires at the church and schoolhouse, dry clothing sorted by size, broth kettles in rotation, and line crews changed every 40 minutes so numb hands did not become another casualty. The first count at daylight marked 312 souls accounted for, with 35 still unconfirmed in outlying lanes where water remained too swift for foot crossings. He sent no one searching alone. 2 by 2, tied to fixed points, they moved house to house with poles and chalk, marking doors checked and names found. His own sod house became a supply depot by necessity rather than declaration. Nathaniel and Rose hauled down the flour Brett had lifted to the loft before the surge, then measured it by cup and weight while Miriam Hale kept a ration list on salvaged telegraph forms. Clara Ortega opened the tallow crocks, rendered enough for lamps, and cut the smoked rabbit into portions so the weakest could eat first. By noon, kettles were running at church, school, and the grain loft. The food was plain and thin. It was steady. That steadiness did more for order than any council motion ever had. On June 20th, with morning temperature at 41 degrees and light rain returning in bands, Brett shifted from extraction to instruction because the town could not depend on his hands alone. He demonstrated 3 knots to mixed crews on the church steps, bowline, chest hitch, and mule release for quick disengagement under load. He taught with rope laid across his forearm and children repeating each step aloud. Men who had laughed from porches copied Rose's finger placement. Women who had never touched line before dawn tied clean loops by supper. When a knot slipped, Brett did not rebuke. He reset and repeated until the motion held. The contrast between modest preparation and expensive confidence stood in plain view across Main Street. Pemberton's warehouse, which had charged for elevated rack space at premium rates, now stank of wet grain and spoiled cloth, with warped account books drying in hopeless stacks by a smoky fire. Brett's shed, built of cheap timber and sod, retained line inventory because racks had been raised and tagged by purpose. Pemberton had sold rope by the foot at 33 cents and lost whole shelves to floodwater. Brett had spun grass and rawhide by lantern and now distributed lifelines without fee. No one needed a speech to understand the arithmetic. 3 days after the crest, when current had dropped enough to walk lower lanes in boots, the dead were carried to higher ground above the new stain line on the hill behind the church. Gideon Hale was buried with his forge hammer laid on the coffin lid before it was lowered, then removed and given to Miriam at her request. Tomas Ortega was buried with a clean key lever wrapped in oilcloth, placed there by Clara, who said that warnings sent in time were also a form of shelter. Ruth Ann Pike was laid between her grandparents, and Reverend Bell read from a rain-spotted page while Abram Pike held the little reader book recovered from the stair collapse. No one spoke long. Wind did the rest. By the first week of July, Cedar Bluff had resumed breath, but not ease. Mud lay thick in alleys, and every repaired threshold bore a line in charcoal marking flood height as a lesson against forgetting. Brett directed crews to reset hidden deadman anchors deeper, 6 feet where soil allowed, with ring points protected by removable plank covers. He required each public building to keep 2 tested rescue braids under oilcloth and 1 dry record board listing last inspection date, line length, and load test result. School resumed in shortened sessions, and knot drills were held after arithmetic, not as novelty but as civic work. 3 days later, a packet arrived from downstream North Fork, carried by Ryder through detours where bridges still stood. Tomas Ortega's final message, fragmentary though it had been, had reached in time for North Fork to move 21 souls from low cabins to mill loft before their own surge hit. The rider brought a written acknowledgment for Cedar Bluff and a small parcel of replacement telegraph tools in Thomas's name. Clara placed the letter on the church table where all could read it. Brett said nothing, then added Thomas's office key, cleaned and untangled, to the memorial shelf Reverend Bell had set near the vestry door. The reckoning began as private visits rather than public theater. On July 9th, Mayor Crowell came to the Harmon yard at sunup, carrying a shovel instead of a hat speech. He worked 2 hours resetting post holes for the new rope walk lane and then said without preface that authority had mistaken calm for prudence. He offered his council stipend for purchase of iron rings and asked Brett to draft an ordinance for fixed lifelines on public structures. Brett handed him a list already written: ring height, anchor depth, inspection intervals, drill dates, and penalties for noncompliance. Crowell took it and returned the next morning with signatures. Others followed over the next 10 days, each with words that did not match one another but bent in the same direction. The school trustee, who had called knot drills institutional failure, came with 3 damaged readers under his arm and asked Rose whether she would show the younger pupils hand wraps to prevent rope burn. 2 ranch hands who had repeated the weeds over hemp line brought cured hides for core stock and requested training for bunkhouse crews upriver. Reverend Bell asked permission to ring hazard without vote whenever Marker 3 took water. Brett answered that Bell should serve danger first and protocol second. Bell had the notice posted by evening. Silas Pemberton waited longest. He did not appear at the Harmon yard until August 2nd, 1889, when heat sat at 79 degrees and the mud smell had finally lifted from Main Street. He came without coat, watch chain, or clerks, and he stood by the rope walk post with both hands visible and empty. Nathaniel and Rose were present, coiling a fresh 60-foot braid with black thread ends. Pemberton asked whether he might speak before work began. Brett nodded once. Pemberton said he had mocked what he did not understand because he believed purchase power and inventory made him guardian of town stability. He said he had blocked anchor posts to protect trade figures, then raised rope prices in fear disguised as discipline, and that the books he tied to his waist on the warehouse roof had not held one soul above water. He named the phrase he had coined Harmon's Grass Bible and said he had used it as ridicule, then watched it become instruction written in hands across Cedar Bluff. He stated in front of Brett's children that he had been wrong in method and in spirit. Then he said he would relinquish his council seat at the next meeting and open his remaining warehouse timber for public anchor platforms at cost, with no credit interest added. Brett listened without interruption, and when Pemberton finished, he did not offer the easy sentence the town seemed to wait for. He looked once toward the hill where 3 fresh markers stood above the floodline, then back to the man before him. He said that graves dug in June were not mended by August declarations, and that forgiveness offered too quickly becomes another form of forgetting. He said Cedar Bluff did not need performance. It needed changed practice that endured through dry years when memory softened. Then he gave terms that were plain and enforceable. Every Saturday at sunup, his yard would hold rope and line instruction. Children first hour, adults second. Attendance would carry no fee. Mockery would be left at the gate, and any household that learned would teach one other household by month's end. Whether that counted as forgiveness, he said, was for each speaker to decide over years, not afternoons. On August 17th, Cedar Bluff held a sober gathering outside the church because the nave could not hold the turnout. The census board, repainted and renailed straight, now listed 344 souls. Reverend Bell read the names of the dead first and let silence stand after each. Then families spoke in turn, not to cleanse themselves by words, but to place facts in common record. Warnings dismissed, prices raised, drills refused, rescue received. Miriam Hale said her husband had died cutting strangers free, and that honor demanded a town where such sacrifice would be less necessary next time. Clara Ortega said her brother had stated key to send warning, and that systems mattered because 1 minute could carry miles. Abram Pike, voice rough and slow, held Ruth Ann's reader against his chest and asked that every child in Cedar Bluff learn letters and lifelines together, never one at the expense of the other. Pemberton spoke near the end and repeated his admission publicly, adding that he had profited from scarcity and from the assumption that commerce alone could govern hazard. He placed his council ledger on the church step, unsigned from that day forward, and stepped back. No one applauded. The tone remained grave, as it should have. Brett spoke last, for fewer than 200 words, in the same measured cadence he used when teaching a knot. He said that his father had taught him in Tennessee Hills that a hand trained in calm could save breath in panic. He said this town had paid tuition in lives and should not waste that costly lesson by arguing over pride. He said he would not pretend injury had not occurred because truth required naming harm, but neither would he build a future on humiliation. He asked for work instead of sentiment. Fixed anchors, inspected lines, shared drills, children taught early, and no household left outside warning because of debt or status. Then he stepped down, took a mallet from Rose and began setting a new ring at the church gate, while others joined him without further ceremony. In the autumn of 1890, 1 year and 4 months after the flood, Town Ordinance No. 7 required fixed lifelines on all public buildings and any new commercial structure above 1 story, with quarterly inspections recorded in open ledger. By the second week of October, rope walks stood behind nearly half the homes in Cedar Bluff, some crude, some elegant, all functional. School lessons paired arithmetic tables with knot sequence recitation. Freight contracts for upstream runs began listing line standards and anchor kits as ordinary equipment, not eccentric burden. In 1894, when spring runoff rose hard but stopped short of disaster, line crews moved early and efficiently. No lives were lost, and the drill log showed 92 adult participants and 60 children across 2 days. In 1897, after a smaller surge cut the ferry road again, North Fork sent thanks and traded iron rings for Cedar Bluff's improved chafe sleeve pattern. Pemberton, no longer council voice, kept store books with plain pricing during flood months and funded 2 public line caches each year from his own account. He never reclaimed the old phrase in jest. By 1902, travelers entering Cedar Bluff through the church lane passed a carved plank at the gate, letters cut deep and tar-darkened against cottonwood grain. Teach the hand before the boast. The saying, "Build it like Harmon," had entered ordinary speech, not as flattery but as specification for work expected to hold under strain. Nathaniel, grown and broad-shouldered, supervised municipal inspections each spring. Rose, now the school's lead instructor for practical studies, could still tie a bowline by touch in darkness and taught first-year pupils to do the same before winter break. The church memorial shelf remains in place. Gideon Hale's hammerhead, Thomas Ortega's key lever, Ruth Ann Pike's reader wrapped in oilcloth, and beside them a small leather tag from one of Brett's earliest rescue braids, the charcoal faded but legible. Cedar Bluff still counts its souls on a board by the post office door. It also counts anchor points, inspected lines, and trained hands. The town learned at cost it never forgot that wisdom mocked in fair weather may be the only bridge left when water takes the street. On the morning of October 18th, 1902, when frost lay again at 29 degrees along the river grass and the census board read 361 souls in fresh white paint, Cedar Bluff gathered in the churchyard for quarterly line inspection, and Brett Harmon stood where the first sanctioned anchor ring had been set 13 years earlier. The ring sat flush in cottonwood planking now, protected by a hinged cover and marked with black numerals burned into the wood. Nathaniel, 26 and broad through the shoulders, opened the cover, ran a gloved hand through the eye, and called out. No scale, no crack, no looseness at seat. Rose, 22, recorded the note in the municipal inspection ledger and moved to the next station with 6 schoolchildren, carrying tagged coils between them in paired formation. Silas Pemberton arrived before sunrise and brought the last unresolved account from the flood year in a flat cedar box tied with plain twine. He had carried that box for more than a decade, though few knew it. When the drills paused for kettle service, he placed it on the church step beside Reverend Bell and asked in a steady voice that Clerk Abel Finch read the contents aloud into public record. Finch opened the lid and removed 8 water-warped promissory notes, all written against emergency storage charges from the week before the flood, all signed by families whose goods had been lost and whose debts Pemberton had never collected. Pemberton said, I kept these to remind myself what greed sounds like when it calls itself order. They are void as of this hour. He fed each note into the stove beside the church wall while witnesses watched in silence. The ash lifted in pale flakes and blew toward the hill where the high water markers still stood. That same morning, Finch resolved his own unfinished burden. He brought out the oilcloth packet containing the telegraph fragments Tomas Ortega had sent to council on June 14, 1889. The packet he had filed when policy preferred calm to warning. The paper had browned at the folds, but the words still showed. Mountain rain continuous. Culvert overtops, trestle compromised. Finch read each fragment aloud, then said he had copied them by hand into the new hazard book, so no future clerk could bury them beneath routine motions. Clara Ortega, now telegraph operator and route supervisor, took the original packet after the reading and placed it in a narrow drawer beneath Thomas's cleaned key lever on the memorial shelf. She set her brother's copper medallion there as well, no longer in her apron pocket, but fixed where schoolchildren could see it when they came for knot lessons. A report once ignored had finally received its proper answer. Permanent record. Public access. Required action. By late afternoon, with wind shifting north and sunlight flattening along the boardwalks, Brett called adults and children together beside the carved plank at the church gate. Pemberton stood in the second row, hat in both hands. Mayor Crowell had died in 1899, and his successor, Martha Keene, stood with the ordinance book open at the clause requiring marker checks before each thaw. Brett did not make a sermon of the hour. He held one line between his palms, showed where chafe begins if pride pulls faster than method, and said, This town once believed warning damaged trade. We learned that delay damages graves. Keep the order. Ride sky, read water, read animals, then set rope before argument starts. Rose then led the children through the old sequence, voices clear and level, anchor hitch, chest loop, belay check, transfer. The youngest were 6 years old. None found it strange. 2 days later, on October the 20th, a rider from North Fork brought written confirmation that Cedar Bluff's revised marker tables and knot curriculum had been adopted unchanged in 3 downstream settlements, with ring height and anchor depth copied to the inch. Nathaniel read the letter aloud in the store, and Pemberton, now gray at the temples and careful in speech, asked that a duplicate be pinned beside price notices each spring, so no one could claim ignorance when water ran high. He had done one more thing without announcement. After the flood, he had recovered what remained of his warehouse ledgers from mud and spread them for drying, then struck out all penalty interest charged during hazard weeks with red charcoal. Those books, once tied to his waist on a roof, now sat in a back cabinet labeled Closed Claims. He kept them not as assets, but as witness. By the first week of November, geese crossed lower than usual, and beaver lodges along the North Bend showed fresh mud piled higher than autumn norm. Cedar Bluff no longer treated those signs as camp stories. At dawn on November the 7th, Rose led 12 pupils and 4 adults to the bank with marked poles and had them measure rise against carved cuts exactly as Brett had done in 1889. They logged color, speed, and debris type on forms printed at the schoolhouse press. The forms included a line titled Animal Indicators and another titled Public Action Triggered. By noon, the findings were copied to the board outside the post office and to the hazard slate in Pemberton's store. No council vote was needed for Bell authority now. Reverend Bell rang one strike at dusk as drill notice, and 64 souls reported within 15 minutes for route walk. Not all reckonings came as speeches. The ranch foreman who had once set a town tied with rope could not call itself civilized never gave Brett a formal apology. He came each thaw season instead with a wagon of cured hide strips and spent 2 evenings cutting coarse stock in the Harmon yard without asking credit or praise. The school trustee who had mocked knot drills retired and left a note in the arithmetic cupboard reading, "Keep both lessons together." Abel Finch, who had buried the warning slips, became the strictest keeper of open records in the territory and refused 3 petitions to classify flood reports as commercial confidential. Some men never spoke of shame aloud, but their hands changed practice, and in Cedar Bluff that counted as truthful amendment. On May 3, 1904, 15 years to the day after Brett's denied council warning, the town held a river drill under clear sky at 68 degrees. The date had been chosen deliberately. Martha Keene read the old denial entry from the 1889 council minutes, then read the current ordinance that replaced it, and closed the book without flourish. Brett stood to one side while Rose and Nathaniel ran command. Children carried 30-foot blue thread bundles like water pails, exactly as they had done in fear, now done in order. At Station 4, one boy mislaid his belay sequence and looked near tears. Pemberton knelt, reset the line in the child's hands, and said, "Again, slower. Correct is faster than proud." The boy nodded and completed the transfer clean. That evening, after drills and cleanup, Brett walked alone to the hill above the flood line where Gideon Hale, Thomas Ortega, and Ruth Ann Pike lay in a lined ground beneath weathered markers. He carried 3 fresh leather tags, each cut by schoolchildren from salvage harness and marked with date and load standard. He tied one to each marker stake and left them there, not as decoration but as statement that memory must stay connected to use. Miriam Hale, slower now and silver-haired, came up the path with Clara and Abram Pike after sunset. Flood night chaos had first put Abram on the death roll after the ferry road collapse, but he was found alive at dawn in Willow Snags downstream, and Finch corrected the ledger. They stood together without speeches. Abram set Ruth Ann's reader, still wrapped in oilcloth, against the marker for a moment, then took it back down to the memorial shelf before dew could settle. Nothing in that gesture was theatrical. Everything in it was exact. In autumn 1910, Brett opened the box he had kept since Eliza's burial journey. showed her thimble to Nathaniel and Rose, and said, "We carry her as practice, not silence." Rose wrote Eliza's name atop the yard lesson ledger. Brett Harmon died on January the 12th, 1911 at age 54, in his own bed under a quilt Rose had mended twice that winter, with temperature outside at 11 degrees and river noise low under shelf ice. The cause listed by Clara in the town register was chest fever, following a week of hard coughing. Nathaniel and Rose closed his hands around no emblem and no title, because he had asked for neither, only for the Saturday yard lessons to continue without interruption if weather allowed. They buried him above the high water line within sight of the church gate plank. Pemberton, older and bent, walked in the second row and carried a coil of black thread rescue braid on his shoulder from house to graveyard, then handed it to Nathaniel at the marker and stepped back. The rope walk behind the Harmon place still stands, rebuilt twice but aligned to the same 84 feet east to west. The church ring at Station 1 is inspected every quarter and replaced when wear exceeds the mark carved into ordnance tables. The school keeps arithmetic in the morning and knot work before supper during hazard months. North Fork and Granite Crossing still send riders for revised chafe patterns every few years. Thomas's telegraph fragments remain in the public drawer. Gideon's hammerhead hangs on the memorial shelf, and Ruth Ann's reader rests in oilcloth beneath glass that Rose ordered from Cheyenne for $2.60, so small fingers could point without damage. At the gate, the plank remains legible in tar-dark letters. Travelers read it aloud when they pass. Children repeat it before they touch a line. Teach the hand before the boast.